Tonight's podcast is 7 ways why indoctrinated education and PhD education is unrealized fogbanks. Indoctrinated education looks like you're learning, but it functions like a memory farm, training people to repeat yesterday's conclusions and live from yesterday. Instead of meeting today with direct perception, it builds identities out of information instead of awareness, leaving students fluent in facts but strangers to their own clarity, wisdom, and innovation. The fog bank forms because the system rewards obedience to inherited frameworks, never the courage to see for yourself. When the mind is taught to trust the past more than its own presence, it becomes loyal to the illusions it never chose. Why this becomes, why indoctrinated education becomes an unrealized egotistic fallback, it replaces perception with pre-approved narratives. Students learn what to think long before they're ever invited to sense what to feel, see, and overcome. The ego absorbs these narratives as identity, mistaking memorized certainty for actual understanding. This creates a fog bank because the mind becomes a strange unit for old ideas instead of a living instrument of awareness. It conditions people to equate correctness with worth, grades, rankings, credentials. These become ego currency. The system trains people to choose approval rather than insight, performance, and their presence. The fog bank thickens because the ego becomes addicted to being right, even when the information is outdated. And how is the world running on outdated information, but we're actually trying to utilize the stuff in the here and now? It teaches survival thinking instead of sovereign clarity. Indoctrinated education rewards compliance, predictability, and intellectual safety. These are survival behaviors, never wisdom. The fog bank forms because the mind learns to avoid uncertainty. How do we avoid uncertainty and out of the ordinary situations? I've gotten a lot better, but I've opened up to questioning, but I still, on the uncertainty, I still question myself. And that's why I'm opening up to understand the fog banks of egotistical arrogance and everything I think and know. Because the mind learns to avoid uncertainty, the very place where real wisdom lives. 7 ways why indoctrinated education and PhD education is unrealized fog banks. Indoctrinated education worships intellect, never awareness. So it produces brilliant minds trapped in outdated identities. Where do you see that in the world today? I see that quite regular, actually. The system trains people to think more, never see more, or feel more. It rewards memory hierarchy and conceptual dominance, all ego fuel. Hellraiser clarity. When the intellect becomes the throne, ego becomes the king. We start zinging from yesterday and never experiencing today. How is the world actually stuck in yesterday? But if you look at it today, it's all rising from yesterday. Creating a PhD culture confuses accumulation with evolution, creating fog banks of overanalysis and under-awareness. Degrees stack, but consciousness never does. People become experts in information, but amateurs in presence. How do you witness that in the world where people become experts, but they live in amateur presence? Hellraiser veracity, you can master a field and still be enslaved by your own mind. Both systems reinforced identity as achievement, so the ego clings to titles instead of authenticity. The more letters after the name, the thicker the fog. That's a true statement. The more the letters after the name, the thicker the fog. Identity becomes academic armor, shielding people from the discomfort of seeing beyond their conditioning. And how do you witness all this fogbank conditioning in the world today? If you listen to the news, that's fogbank conditioning. And a lot of people in self-help personal growth have a lot of fogbank conditioning. Change, heal, create transformation. That's fogbank conditioning. With the Hellraiser punchline, when your worth is tied to your resume, clarity becomes a threat. Where do you see people afraid of clarity in your life? You know, when people, and I'm guilty of this myself, but when I start having to be right, that's my fog bank. Why education in business is stuck in egotistical fog banks. Education and business stay stuck in egotistical fog banks because both systems were built to protect their authority, never expand their awareness, their adventurer's awareness. The reward performance, hierarchy, and predictability, conditions that keep people operating from yesterday's mindsets instead of present moment wisdom. Why education and business remain trapped in ego fog. The core issue is that both systems rely on identity, certainty, and control, which are the ego's favorite survival tools. When a system depends on these tools, it can never evolve. It can only defend itself. How does education defend itself and PhD? Have you ever been in when a CEO and you start asking questions and they start defending the plan? That's what people do to plans, is they defend them. And I witnessed that. Education and business worship knowing instead of seeing, witnessing. And see, you think you know your way to yesterday. That's the simplest thing there is. Both systems elevate memorized information, credentials, and expertise as the highest currency. This creates a fog bank because people cling to what they already know. That's what education does, is cling to what it already knows. To me, anyway. They defend outdated models. They mistake intellectual certainty for actual clarity. In both classrooms and boardrooms, the ego becomes the decision maker. In classrooms and boardrooms, the ego becomes the decision maker. When knowing becomes identity, evolution becomes impossible. They reward obedience to old frameworks, and the world is stuck in social obedience. And I've really witnessed that, but what it really is I'm starting to really witness it and question it in my own life to liberate me from me. Instead of awareness, new realities. Education trains people to follow instructions. Education trains people to follow instructions. Business trains people to follow systems. Neither trains people to perceive directly. This creates a culture where people wait for permission. Innovation feels dangerous. Questioning the model feels like betrayal. The fog bank forms because the system values stability over truth. A structure built on obedience can never recognize opportunity or expansion. It can only replicate the past. And how's the world stuck in the structure of the history and we can never, and all we do is replicate the past? How is today replicating what our ancestors did? They operate from survival logic, never sovereign never sovereign wisdom. Both systems were designed during eras of scarcity, hierarchy, and industrial control. The survival architect still runs underneath in everybody. A fear of being wrong, fear of losing status, fear of disrupting the hierarchy, and the fear of never fitting the model creates survival thinking is always ego thinking. The ego thinking always produces fog banks. Where do you see that in the world today? I see it all over. A system built on survive can never teach you how to awaken your heart, soul. It keeps you stuck in emotional fog banks, but also emotional an emotional hierarchy, but it also keeps you stuck in soul tattoos. While you can't master a field, why can you master a field and still be enslaved by your own mind? You can master a field and still be enslaved by your own mind because skill never dissolves the ego. Expertise doesn't guarantee awareness. Mastery sharpens your abilities, but only presence sharpens your perception and your abilities to rise, shine, and energize. When the ego runs the inner script, even the most accomplished people can remain trapped in invisible limits. Where do you see that in your life? I see that in my life, but I'm always questioning for invisible limits and unrealized stuff, and all the stuff that I've tried to hide from all my life is still it's it's wanting to be away from me, and I want it away from me. Why mastery doesn't free you from mental fog. Mastery builds competence, ego builds confinements. When the two collide, you get a person who is brilliant on the outside and blind on the inside. Mastery strengthens the persona, never the perceiver. When you become exceptional at something, ego often claims ownership. This is who I am. That identity becomes a cage. Oh, yeah, I got one of them. And because you defend your expertise, you resist being wrong. I never resist being wrong. I feel blessed that I'm imperfect. You cling to what you already know. The fog bank forms when mastery becomes self-definition instead of self-expression. Skill expands your capability. Ego shrinks your awareness. Mastery lies on repetition, but awareness requires novelty. To master a field, you repeat patterns until they become automatic. But the mind that runs on autopilot can never see beyond its own habits. Where do you see that in your life? I see that in my life. That was an awakening for me. I like getting these kind of questions because it awakens me. This creates a split. Your craft evolves, your consciousness never does. You become brilliant in the field and blind in the self, in the sovereignty of yourself. Repetition builds expertise. Presence builds freedom. Mastery can inflate confidence while hiding the unconscious fear. Why do people even go out here and do this, but they still have unconscious fear? Because it's beyond the comfort zone of what they know. The more skilled you become, the more ego fears losing that identity. So it protects itself with certainty, control, defensiveness, and perfectionism. Oh yeah, it does me. These are fog banks disguised as competence. The ego uses mastery as armor, never liberation. Why comfort zone programming is egotistical fogbanks. Comfort zone programming becomes an egotistical fogbank because it trains the mind to mistake familiarity for truth, safety for wisdom, and repetition for reality. It's the ego's favorite habitat, predictable, insulated, and identity protecting it so it hides its own limits behind a feeling of this is just how I am. And see, that is kind of just how I am is kind of that's a fog bank. Why comfort zone programming becomes an ego fog bank. Comfort zones are never neutral. They're psychological survival loops disguised as stability. They keep the nervous system loyal to yesterday's patterns while blocking today's clarity. How do you block your own clarity? Everything your life is you block it, it's all you. The outside world is an irritant, an agitator for you to bust out of yesterday. Comfort zones protect the ego, never the self. The comfort zone is the ego's safe house. It's a place to avoid uncertainty, exposure, and the possibility of being wrong. I've never been wrong in my life. I've just innovated a lot of life expanding experiences. This creates a fog bank because the ego confuses emotional safety with actual truth, making everything unfamiliar feel dangerous, even when it's liberating. The ego calls it comfort, awareness calls it confinement. Comfort zones recycle old identity patterns and call them who I am. So a lot of the stuff we think we're really rising out of, we're falling into one of our fog banks. The mind uses past experiences, old emotional chemistry, and outdated self stories to define what feels normal. This creates a fog bank because the comfort zone is built from yesterday's data, never today's perception, never the here and now perception. You end up living inside a memory instead of a moment. And see, that's what we do is we live inside a memory, never live and never experience the freshness of here and now. The ego prefers the predictable over unpredictable, over the unpredictable present. Comfort zone rewards stagnation and punish expansion. Every time I try to grow, the ego triggers fear, doubt, hesitation, and overthinking. That's what chaos is in the real world, in the physical world. It's the ego triggering your fear, doubt, hesitation, and overthinking to keep you safe. Never because you're in danger, but because your identity feels threatened. This is the fog bank the ego mistakes for expansion for annihilation. It would rather keep you small than let you evolve. Have anybody happened to anybody? Pick me. The ego fears growth because growth dissolves the ego. Why indoctrinated education worships intellect, never awareness. So it produces brilliant minds trapped in outdated identities. Where do you see that in the world today? If you listen to the news or the media, you see it there a lot. Indoctrinated education worships intellect over awareness. And that signal distortion creates a whole architecture of fog banks. Brilliant minds operate from outdated identities, inherited frameworks, and ego-driven certainty. These key points cut into why that happens and how the fog forms, how intellect worships creates ego fog banks. Education elevates mental accumulation while ignoring perceptual clarity. That imbalance produces people who are highly trained yet inwardly confined. Where do you see that in the self-help, personal growth, business world all over? Intellect becomes identity, so people defend knowledge instead of updating perception. When the intellect is the throne, the ego becomes the king. Students learn to be someone who knows, never someone who sees, witnesses the fresh experiences of life. This traps them in defending their expertise, protecting their worldviews, resisting anything that threatens their identity. The fog bank forms because the mind becomes loyal to its past conclusions. And that's the thing, the mind becomes loyal to the past conclusions. Brilliance becomes a cage when identity is built from information instead of awareness. Intellect relies on memory, so people navigate the present with yesterday's mental maps. Awareness is alive and responsive. Intellect is archived and repetitive. Education trains people to rely on theories, models, frameworks, and citations, all of which come from the past. This creates a fog bank because the mind uses old data to interpret the now, the here and now. You can master a field and still be blind to the moment you're actually living in. Intellect rewards certainty, which is ego's favorite survival mechanism. Awareness thrives in curiosity, ego thrives in certainty, and education rewards certainty. Right answers, correct interpretations, predictable thinking, and stable conclusions. This conditions people to fear ambiguity and the very space where insight lives, thrives, and energizes you. The fog bank thickens because certainty becomes more important than veracity or authenticity. The ego clings to what it knows. Awareness explores what it doesn't. Why indoctrinated education instills egotistical fog banks with a I have to be right attitude. Indoctrinated education installs a I have to be right attitude because it conditions the mind to equate correctness with safety. That's one thing the mind will always do is take you back to safety. It's never going to take you forward. Your intuition, imagination, and your own courage will move you forward. Identity and worth. That conditioning becomes an egotistical fog bank, a mental haze where you can no longer distinguish truth from the need to protect their own image. These points cut into the mechanics of how that fog forms and why it's so hard to see from the inside. How indoctrinated education wires a I must be right reflex. The system rewards certainty, punishes curiosity, and trains the ego to treat being wrong as a threat. You're never wrong, you're just being showed your dead end as a threat rather than an opening. And see, that's one thing we was taught in school. If we was wrong or went against what the teacher thought, we was always wrong. we just never saw the question the same way the teacher did. It ties correctness to identity, so being wrong feels like annihilation. From early schooling and onward, correctness becomes a form of survival, grades, praise, and approval. Belonging. The ego absorbs this as a core rule. If I'm wrong, I'm unsafe. That creates a fog bank because the mind stops seeking truth and starts defending itself. A person becomes brilliant at protecting their identity, blind to anything that challenges them. How do we do that? When it starts challenging us, we step back into the cocoon of yesterday. It rewards memorization over perception, so people cling to old answers instead of sensing fresh realities. Indoctrinated education trains the mind to rely on stored information, never direct awareness. When the world shifts, the ego still clings to what it memorized. If you look at the world today on the surface, how's it clinging to what it memorized? You can see that in a lot of places because that's where the ego's worth lives, is in yesterday. This creates a fog bank of outdated certainty. People defend yesterday's answers, even when today's demands fresh foresight to light the light of life. The I have to be right attitude is just ego protecting its archive. Boy, I've done that one a lot. It conditions people to fear uncertainty, which is where real wisdom actually breathes, opening up fresh experiences. The system punishes not never knowing, guessing, or exploring, or questioning. So that the ego learns to avoid ambiguity. Ambiguity is just it's just it's basically an amazement. It's just the unknown at all costs. As awareness requires ambiguity, it's the doorway to insight. The fog bank forms because the ego would rather cling to a wrong answer or a bad way rather than enter the unknown. Man, I've done that one. Stayed with a bad way. It's never confidence, it's survival dressed as certainty. Why indoctrinated education, PhD education, installs egotistical fog banks and perfection programming. Indoctrinated education instills perfection programming because it conditions the mind to equate flawlessness with safety. Correctness with identity, and mistakes with danger. That conditioning becomes an egotistical fog bank, a mental haze, where the person can never distinguish genuine expansion from compulsive need to appear right, polished, and acceptable. How indoctrinated education wires perfection into the ego. Perfection programming is never natural, it's installed. It's the byproduct of systems that reward compliance, punishes uncertainty, and elevates performance over perception. It ties self-worth to flawless performance, so the ego fears anything imperfect. From early schooling onward, the message is clear. Be perfect or be punished. Your imperfections will show you the way through challenges. Grades, rankings, elevations, and standardized tests teach the nervous system that mistakes are threats, never teachers. This creates an egotistical fog bank because the mind becomes obsessed with avoiding error instead of exploring truth. Perfection becomes a shield, never a skill. It trains the mind to obey external standards instead of sensing internal clarity. Perfection programming is built on rules, rubrics, and right answers. Students learn to follow the model, never follow their awareness. This creates a fog bank because the ego becomes loyal to external approval rather than internal perception. The person becomes excellent at meeting expectations and terrible at meeting themselves and trusting their abilities. It conditions people to fear uncertainty, which is where real intelligence actually lives. Perfection programming punishes experimentation, curiosity, and ambiguity. The ego learns to avoid anything that can't be controlled or predicted. This creates a fog bank because the mind clings to the known even when the known is outdated. Perfection becomes a prison of predictability. While indoctrinated education instills social obedience and follow the herd controllability. Indoctrinated education instills social obedience because it conditions the mind to trade its own perceptions for external approval. Where do you see that in your life? I see it in mine, but not very often anymore. The conditioning becomes an egotistical fog bank, a mental haze where people follow the herd, trust authority over awareness, and becomes predictable, even to be easily steered. How indoctrinated education creates a herd minded obedience. This system rewards compliance, punishes deviation, and trains the ego to equate belonging with safety. That combination produces minds that are intelligent yet controllable. Where do you see that in your life and in the world? It replaces inner authority with external approval, so people obey to feel right. From the childhood, students learn that the teacher, the test, and the institution define correctness. This conditions the ego to seek validation, stay in the fog bank instead of understanding and witnessing clarity. Once the mind believes approval equals safety, obedience becomes automatic and the fog bank forms because the person stops asking, is this authentic? And starts asking, is this acceptable? It punishes deviation so the nervous system learns to follow the herd to avoid rejection. Schools reward conformity, same answers, same pace, same behavior. Where do you see that in the world today? Standing out risks embarrassment, judgment, or failure. The ego internalizes as a survival rule. Blend in or be punished. That rule becomes a fog bank because the mind avoids originality, intuition, and sovereign perceptions. Herd behavior becomes a reflex, never a choice. It trains people to trust systems more than their own awareness, making them predictable and easy to steer. Indoctrinated education teaches people to rely on experts, institutions, rules, and standardized thinking. This creates a mental dependency on external authority. When people stop trusting their own perceptions, they become easy to influence. Where do you see that in your life and in the world today? Not because they're weak, because they were trained to outsource their judgment. The fog bank thickens when the ego believes obedience is intelligence. And if you really look at the world and look at the surface of the world and the interaction, you'll see how the world becomes trained. Well, anyway, I'm Robert Wilson, and may your week go flow with ease and fun of the sun. So anyway, we'll see you Thursday night with why titleocracy controls the world.